Welcome to the second episode of the Data Protectors podcast. For those who did not tune into the first episode, the goal of this podcast series is to offer guidance to small and medium-sized businesses and organizations on how to comply with the Kenyan Data Protection Act. Today, we are coming to you with an exciting episode that we've been developing to help our audience to register as data controllers and processors, which is a crucial step towards compliance. Registration is a small and straightforward but integral part of the compliance journey and is crucial for small and medium-sized organizations to consider. But before that, let's look at the partners behind this podcast. Have you heard of the African Union European Union Digital for Development Hub? In a nutshell, it's a project that aims to increase cooperation in the digital field between Africa and Europe, and it is implemented by 8 organizations including GIZ, the German Development Agency. Did you know that our Data Privacy and Protection Act in Kenya was inspired by the European one, which is called the GDPR? Therefore, data protection is an exciting and promising field for Africa and Europe to collaborate on, which is how this podcast came to life. We'll share more information about the AU-EU D4D Hub project and the partners as we go along, but let's start hearing from our guests. For this episode, I'm excited to introduce our guest moderator Priya Shah and our 2 speakers, Rosemary Koech and Wangari Elaine. They'll serve as our guides for this episode.
Hi, Mashak. Thanks a lot. My name is Priya Shah. I work as the Director Risk and Privacy Compliance at CarePay. CarePay is the home of MTIBA. So MTIBA is a healthcare platform that you may have heard of. We support any healthcare journey, basically, from donors paid journeys to insurance journeys. There, of course, I've been doing data protection for the last 3 years. Since CarePay is a European-based company, we're based in Amsterdam. We've been working on GDPR compliance for much longer than some of the companies that have been working in Kenya. So I have experience working with the GDPR, also NDPR in Nigeria, because we have an entity in Nigeria. And of course, the last year or so, very much focused on Kenya. I've also recently, just because I wanted to connect with more people in the Kenyan space doing data protection, I'm also part of the Kenya Privacy Professionals Association. I'm actually the vice chair there. And that was set up basically to help in these kind of setups, to try and connect more people, create a support network for people who are trying to understand data protection from scratch. So I'm really happy to be here. And looking forward to the discussions today. So I think today we are going to talk about, basically focus on the registration process, because that can sound very daunting for people. I have personally gone through the process, so it's not as difficult, but let's break that down a bit more today. So with me, I have Rosemary Koech, who's the Chief Data Protection Officer at KCB Bank. Welcome, Rosemary. Do you want to say something, a quick introduction?
Yes, I'm Rosemary Chamutai Koech Kimwatu. I'm the Data Protection Officer at KCB Group, and there I assist helping the group with compliance on data protection. The term chief sounds nice, but it's not my official title. But yeah, happy to be here, Priya. Happy to have great conversations. You're my industry colleague at the Kenya Privacy Professional Association. Happy that we're together supporting this. I'm also a vice chair of the Data Privacy and Governance Society of Kenya. So happy to be here, and also part of the partners that are arranging the podcast.
Yeah, we also have Wangari Elaine from the UK, she's a data professional based in the UK. Wangari, would you like to give us a quick introduction?
Yes, my name is Wangari, and I work as a data protection specialist for HTB Group, which is essentially a group of 4 charities who have very different mandates, and so essentially help with their cross-border data transfers, assessments, implementation of new technology, and just the day-to-day processing of helping them with their processing activities across the group.
Well, it's fantastic. So we have experts from 2 different regions. So I think this will be really good. So maybe just to start off, in the Kenyan registration process, of course, there are rules. You join whether you're a data controller or a data processor. So, of course, that's one step that entities need to be aware of, and we'll break that down a bit further. There are regulations, there are guidelines on the website, but basically any company that has a turnover of more than 5 million shillings and more than 10 staff is required to register. And to support with that, we'll just dive straight in. So when we talk about data controllers and data processors, and Rosemary, maybe you can help us with this. How do you define the two entities, and how can we help the audience make a distinction of where they fit?
Thanks, Priya. That's a great question because many people sometimes get lost wondering, am I a data controller? Am I a data processor? But I think the important thing to know is that in Kenyan legislation, the legal obligations are actually the same for both. So the data controller is a person who may be alone or jointly with other persons in common with other persons as a statutory duty or in their normal work determines a purpose for and the way data is processed or to be processed. So let me give you an example. For a bank like the one I work for, by the time you need to open somebody's account, you ask them for particular information, fill your account opening form, put in your name, put in your ID, put in your home address, and a few other details that maybe are requested. That entity, for its purpose, in order to deliver its mandate, needs that information. So they ask our data subjects to hand it over to them. So now that person becomes a data controller because they collect that data in order for them to offer maybe a service or to do even a statutory duty in some instances. So that's a data controller. A data processor now is a person who's a natural legal person or a public authority or agency or any person who processes personal data on behalf of the controller. So this is a person now who comes in on the instructions of the controller to process data for one reason or another. I'll give again the banking example. So you've come, we've opened your account, and one day you decide you want to get a loan, and we need to do a few things in order to hand over the loan to you. So the next thing that happens is that we have information sharing, say with the Credit Reference Bureau, who we share the information. They tell us, okay, Rosemary is creditworthy up to a certain amount. So that's basically it. So the data now processor acts on the instructions of a controller in order to facilitate data processing for one reason or another. So the list can be endless. It can be all sorts of examples. I think I've given the banking example. There's so many others. It can even be the systems that you use to automate your work. Processors are very wide in terms of numbers. It can be somebody, maybe HR is outsourced. You don't do it internally. So the person whom you've outsourced that function to is a person on your behalf. If you are, say, again, a financial services provider and you need to have people collect loans on your behalf, the person who's collecting debts is a debt controller on a processor on your behalf. That debt collector is a data processor on your behalf. In terms of an SME, I think who are our target audience here today? You, as an SME in your day-to-day work, can be a data controller, and then our processor then comes in as somebody who assists you. It can be your QuickBooks, somebody whom you're using to help you with your analysis of your documentation. It can even be your lawyer. It can be anybody that you interact with in order to assist your business on its day-to-day work, or even maybe a debt collector that you have. So that's a relationship between a data controller and data processor. But however, to remind us that the legal obligations are on both.
Thank you so much, Rosemary. I think that's very useful. The data controller determines the purpose and the what they are going to process and the why. And this is based on the personal data you process. So personal data is anything that can link up to an individual's identity, right? So it could be your name, your date of birth, your gender, but it needs to be information that can zero down to an individual. So Wangari, do you want to add anything more on the data processors, data controllers distinction?
Yes, Rosemary has covered it in a very, very great way. But at the same time, organizations also have to understand that sometimes you can be both, depending on your processing activities. Or, for example, a processor who starts off as a processor, but then they realize, for example, we can use this data for other things. For example, analyzing online behaviors of people, or how can we market to them, and etc. So the minute you create a new purpose for that data, then from a controller perspective, you immediately shift and become a controller. And so in that case, then we start talking about joint controllers. And so in that case, again, the obligations, as Rosemary said, they are similar, but at the same time, you have to understand your obligations and what they relate to in regards to your processing.
Yeah, thank you so much. I definitely found it really useful to document where I am a processor versus where I'm a controller, because more than likely entities will can be both, because obviously for your employees you are always a controller. You are the person who processes their data, and naturally most entities will be using will be doing stuff for other companies and likely to be processors as well. So I think from my perspective, it's really useful if people can start thinking through their documentation and the processing they do. Rosemary, you've done the registration process and it may sound quite daunting, but maybe it would be useful to break it down into steps so the audience can think about, once they determine whether they are controllers or processors, what else do they need to do?
Okay. I think the portal for registration opened on July the 14th in 2022. And around that time, I think we all maybe thought it's just a simple form fill in, yeah, I'm registered. So shock on people who walked in and realized, oh, I need to do a bit of background in terms of work. So I'm going to give a brief explanation of what that is. So of course, the registration portal is on the regulator's website, the ODPC portal. It's available online. If you check it out immediately, I think you go to the landing page. There's actually a key where you can click to begin registration. So now you register, and it's known as a data handler registration. So data controllers and data processors are allowed to register through the portal. So once you click the account link, it allows you to sign in. But of course, if you've never signed in before, you'll need to register. Either you need to register as a handler. So it requires an email and then, of course, a password. Then that develops. So once you have your link, then you're able now to log in. So if it's already an existing account, then you put in the email address and the password. If you're registering afresh, you go and click on register as a data controller and then to create an account. So to register an account, if you're registering for the first time, you click on first time registration. But if you had started the registration process before and you need to proceed, go on resuming registration. So the first stage is a verification, where you first, that is a pre-registration process. So when you go in there, you say, am I a first-time registration or is it a resuming registration? And then you put in your basic details, and it actually guides you. So the first tab is verification. Then when you go next, you identify yourself. Are you a data controller or a data processor? In some instances, are you both? So the system as it is right now only allows you to register one at a time. So you need to clearly...
Sorry.
No, it's okay. Bless you. So you need to first identify, are you a data controller or a data processor? I'm hoping that the explanations that Priya Wangari and I have given will help you determine which you are. So if you're a data controller, then say, for example, you're a data controller, then you provide now basic information. In the pre-registration process, especially if it's a first-time registration, you'll see a tab where you can put in your details. Either there's your name, your phone number, your email address, the institution you belong to, and then, of course, the relation you have to the institution. So if appropriate, then you indicate what is your relation to the institution. I guess this part is important because sometimes as an SME, you might not have done this by yourself. You might have used maybe somebody to assist you with it. So you need to say, what is your relation to the institution? Maybe it's a lawyer who's doing it on your behalf. It can be a privacy practitioner. So once you've put in the pre-registration process information, then now you select the relevant category, either data controller or data processor. And immediately after that, now you provide information about your entity. So you need to upload your entity's establishment documents, business registration services. I think in Kenya, you need your number, your BRS number in order to input. Of course, I'm sure you'll ask what is your BRS number. It's that number at the bottom for the company's registry that identifies your number. So if you're an individual processing personal data, then you put your establishment document, either your national ID or your passport. And if you have a data protection officer, a DPO like Rosemary, you can provide contact details of the appointed data protection officer. And it's important at this point to also indicate that a data protection officer, for example, an SME, you might not be able to have one for yourself. One data one data protection officer can act on behalf of a number of entities. So you might have a DPO acting on behalf of one SME and another in another. So you provide the contact details, and then including the group of companies, or maybe if one person maybe works for a group or maybe works only for one entity. And then if you have not appointed a data protection officer, you can provide the contact person of the individual whom the the Office of the Data Protection Commissioner can liaise with. And then also you can leave it blank. I think that's also an option. Then, of course, once you register with your basic information, as I had mentioned, so of course, institution and name, the postal address, the telephone number, the legal establishment. So, of course, that is a drop-down box. You get to say, is it a company, is it whatnot? And, of course, you also drop-down box the sector, and then the subsector, and then, of course, the national ID. And then once you've done that, now comes the critical part, which many people don't think about. You need to identify the classes and categories of personal data processed. If you had never thought about it before, then you start scratching your head. You're like, okay, so what kind of data what categories do I process? Maybe you don't even know what data you process on a day-to-day basis. So the categories that are listed, it's very helpful on the portal. So you can say employee data, client data, student data, supplier data. It can be shareholders, etc. So that helps to guide you to identify what kind of personal data the category that you handle, and then of course a description of the personal data to be processed, and of course it is name, address, ID number. So you must ask yourself, what personal data does my organization handle? So, say for example, you are an SME that's providing maybe a payroll service to several other businesses. You need to ask yourself, by the time we're offering those payroll services, what personal data sets do I handle in my day-to-day work? And now you list those as a description of the personal data to be processed. And then, of course, the purpose, again, the example of the payroll handling company, I process this data in order to be able to help businesses manage payrolls. So you need to then now put your purpose. And I guess the examples could be varied. You could be an SME that's handling medical records. You could be an SME that's maybe an e-market, or offering digital services, maybe online, maybe sell goods, maybe offer other services. So you just need to be very clear in terms of what personal data it is that you handle. Then, of course, next is a list of sensitive personal data. So you need to tick the box applicable or not applicable. If it is applicable, you state the purposes for which you're processing the relevant sensitive personal data. And I think at some point we'll give an explanation of what sensitive personal data is. And then after that, now you need to mention, do you transfer personal data outside Kenya? And many businesses are not even sure. You'll talk to somebody like, do you transfer personal data outside Kenya? No, I don't transfer. I just put it on the cloud and work without realizing maybe your cloud service provider, their instance is not local. It could be international. So it's also very important now to even have a discussion with your vendors, those ones who provide you different systems. Say, for example, the payroll processing SME that I was using. Example, if they have a system that they utilize, you then now need to go and have a conversation with your vendor and ask, so where is my data stored exactly? Where does it reside? Is it in Kenya? Is it in Ireland? Is it South Africa? Does it live, or do you do it on servers that are only in Kenya? So you start as a business person, even as an SME, start having to think a bit technical, not too much, just enough for you to register. And then, of course, if it's not applicable, you proceed to the next step. And then now, importantly, you need to list the risks and safeguards for protection of personal data that you've done as a business. This is step 9. So you should list the risks, for example, unauthorized access, unlawful disclosure, theft, amongst others. So the risks are not the same for every business. It depends on the kind of work that you do. So you must be introspective, critically analyze your business and ask yourself, what are the inherent risks that I face? And then now you should also now describe the safeguards and security measures that are in place to protect the personal data. For example, things like physical access controls, fine-grained access controls, visitors logbooks, privacy notices, all the things that you have done, firewalls, antivirus, policies that you've put in place. So you need to check. And if you haven't, I think it also gives you a very nice time to reflect and ask yourself, what is it that I need to do in order to become compliant, even as I register? So I think for me, even for an SME, this registration process is very nice because it gives you data privacy compliance 101 crash course, even as you're registering. And then finally, of course, you identify the payment tier. I think it's automated. So if you're a government entity, non-profit making entity, your fee is calculated automatically. If you have an annual turnover of revenue of less than 5 million and less than 10 employees, you must identify which non-exempt mandatory registration entity your entity belongs to if you're registering. Of course, non-exempt means that you must be registered. And then if your entity does not engage in any of the activities in the non-exempt mandatory registration, then you then proceed to cancel the application if you find that you've reached all that way and you're not. So then, of course, you need to give that information. You'll see a drop-down. Select your turnover, select the number of employees that you have, and then you proceed to the next one. And then, of course, now you make your payment. There are various options that are given. It's M-Pesa, maybe through deposit in an account, mobile money, credit card, checks. So yeah, those are the options that are there.
Yeah, thank you, Rosemary. I think that's quite a detailed breakdown of what you need to do. Basically, you need to prepare yourselves. I think it's wise to think about all this data that you will require and work through it earlier before you log into the portal, so that you have less hiccups as you go along. But the registration portal does allow you to save data as you go along, so it is
Yes.
something you can do in bits and pieces as you work through the bits of data that you need to collect. But after all this registration process, maybe I'd like to focus on the benefits of registration, because it does feel like, yes, it's a process. And yes, it helps you understand the data you process, because you may not have thought about this as intensively as the registration process asks you to. But I think, like Rosemary said, it makes you think through your processing journey. And therefore, if you didn't have controls in place, it kind of forces you to think about some of these controls. So maybe let's focus on the benefits of that registration. Wangari, do you want to kick us off with what you see as benefits of registration holistically, and then we'll come back to Rosemary on the Kenyan context?
Yes, yeah, that sounds great. Registration, as you highlighted earlier, could be a daunting process that most organizations would choose not to go through that path, given the detailed information that they must give. But the over and above compliance with the law, I believe other key benefits include, for example, other organizations trusting that you are compliant with the law, because no organization would want to work with an organization that hasn't done its bit to be compliant. A good example is that under the Kenyan Data Protection Act, registration details are public information. So you'd find big organizations that say work from Europe and they're coming to start a business in Kenya or want to partner with businesses in Kenya, they will do their due diligence. And during that due diligence process, they might find that you're not a registered business that complies with the law. And given where they're coming from, having complied with either EU GDPR or the UK GDPR, they wouldn't want to work with an organization that isn't compliant. So from that perspective, then you make yourself more attractive to investment opportunities. At the same time, at a consumer level, most people every day are now becoming aware of data protection. They're becoming aware of what's happening with their data, and they're asking these questions. And so again, customers will trust businesses that are privacy conscious, that understand the customer needs and see the need of protecting that information. Additionally, being compliant and registered, it's one key element of compliance, where the ODPC, if they decide to do an audit, they will be able to come through and see when you're registered and given the information that you've given us, indeed you're complying with what you've said that you're doing. That's businesses that are registered as opposed to businesses that haven't been registered. A good example in the UK is that companies that are not registered or trying to avoid registration, there is a £4,000 penalty. I'm not sure if the ODPC will go through this route to try and make sure that everyone that needs to be registered is actually registered, but it is quite a good incentive. And what they actually do is publish a list of companies that are not registered. Again, it goes back down to business profits, losses, and overall reputation of an organization. And so I think it's definitely a good idea to get registered.
Yeah, that's really great. So in Kenya, as Wangari has said, the list of people, companies that are registered is public. It's on the website. So that's your incentive to register, because you want, as she said, many companies will be hesitant to work with entities that are not registered. Of course, the Kenyan regulator has been flexible, is trying to encourage businesses to register, and so we should take advantage of that pace and register early. Rosemary, do you have anything to add on the benefits from the Kenyan context?
I think from the Kenyan context, as I explained as I was doing this whole exercise, it's the fact that you also get to learn what you need to do to be compliant. I think for me that's the most important thing. It almost helps even do a quick gap analysis and almost start saying, okay, these are things I should do better. So overall, for an SME, then you help build your privacy compliance muscle that maybe you hadn't even ever imagined before. So I think for me that's the greatest benefit. And yes, of course, the corporate value of it, that people trust you.
Yeah, so I think all that work that goes into registration has a lot of value, and very soon companies will find it difficult to work with others if they haven't registered. So I think this is the time to do this gap analysis and move towards a registration.
Actually, one more thing is that right now, if say you're an SME that is regulated by another regulator, you'll now find them asking you, say for example, you want to be a digital service, like a digital lending provider under the CBK. They'll ask you, have you been registered with the ODPC? So we're finding it's becoming a KYC requirement. Even in tendering for an SME, it's important. It's becoming part of the KYC documents, because people don't want to work with entities that are not registered. So I think that's also a critical part, especially for compliance as you look for more work or even as you look for licensing in the various industries that you're in.
Yeah, I think one of the things we talked about is as part of your controls, you could have privacy notices or policies. Maybe we can zero in a little bit on what these policies are about and how do you go about setting them up. So, Wangari, do you want to kick us off on privacy notices, privacy data protection policies? Maybe just to give the audience a little bit of a snapshot on how they go about these.
Sure. First of all, I'll start with sort of an overall analysis of what they are. And so in the UK, a data protection policy or privacy policy is an internal facing document, which means it's a document similar to a HR policy or a health and safety policy that talks about your business practices with regards to privacy. So for example, what data do you process? How do you process that data? What controls and measures do you have in place to make sure that that data is safe, and etc. So it is a very important document. It is not necessarily legally required in the UK, but then it is just one of the things that helps build your privacy management. On the other hand, a privacy notice is an outward-facing document. So this is facing your customers, this is facing your suppliers, and essentially it is telling the world how you process data. It is telling your customers what their subject rights are, how they can exercise those rights. It's telling them where you send data, for example. However, in the Kenyan scope, those two have sort of been merged, where the Kenyan Data Protection Act talks about the data protection policy, which essentially it's a legally required document, and it does mirror all the requirements needed for the data protection notice that I described. So for example, who you are, what data are you processing and why you're processing it, for how long you will process it for, if you're sending it outside, who are you sending it outside to, and etc. So essentially, from a Kenyan perspective, that is a legally required document. And sort of places where you can find examples of this. The UK ICO website does have templates and guidance on how to create one. But over and above that, I believe when you look at the requirements under the general data protection regulations, then it does have sort of like a summary of what should be reflected in that. So that would be a very good place to start from.
Yeah, that's really useful, and as you've heard from Wangari, that creating some of these notices and policies actually help you towards understanding, where you're what you're processing. So it could be part and parcel of your documentation journey, even as you prepare for registration. It is a requirement, and your customers look out for this on your website. So something obviously important to factor in. Maybe we can talk about yeah the fears around the registration process, and how daunting it may feel. Maybe Rosemary has some quick tips of how to prepare for this process, apart from what we've already discussed.
I think critically, I think it's to do a quick high-level data mapping, and almost like as I mentioned, it's something where you look inside and ask yourself, what data do I handle? What don't I handle? And of course, for us, the high-level data mapping is a critical thing. You just you look at your value chain. From the point you interact, say, with a customer, up to the point when you end your engagement, up to the point even when you tell them, if you liked my services, press 1. And if you liked it, would you recommend me to somebody else? You see, that whole user interface between a data subject and your business, because it just doesn't have to be a customer, it can even be your employees. You need to have a critical evaluation of that. And I think for me, that's the most critical thing, even before you register. But the beauty about it is that you realize what you need as you move along in the registration process.
Fantastic. I think we're coming to the end of this podcast, so I will give Rosemary a few minutes to maybe wrap up the session. We've obviously talked about the registration process. We've talked about the documents you require. We've talked about how you can prepare for it. We've talked about which entities need to register. Of course, in Kenya, there are those entities that are mandatory for registration. Maybe Rosemary wants to give a quick highlight on that as we prepare to give our final remarks.
Yes. I think for me that's very critical, Priya. There's some processes that are not exempt from mandatory registration, which means that you must register. And at this point, it doesn't matter about your annual turnover, the revenue, or the number of employees you have. So these are entities, they're quite a number, but I'll quickly rush through them. Those that converse for political support amongst the electorate, those ones that operate credit bureaus, crime prevention and prosecution of offenders, including if you operate CCTV systems, including private security service providers, debt administration and factoring, gaming and betting operations, those who provide education, so schools. A number of SMEs or schools, you must register. Health administration and provision of patient care, prayers people. Hospitality industry firms, insurance administration, faith-based and religious organizations. So when maybe go to church, the mosque, or to the temple, ask them, have we registered as a data controller? And then, of course, retirement benefits administrators, property management, including those who sell land, those who provide financial services, telecommunications networks or service providers, businesses that are wholly or mainly indirect marketing, and then, of course, internet access providers, transport services, public sector bodies, and businesses that process genetic data.
Yeah, so and all these need to register because obviously they process a lot of sensitive information, and therefore it's a mandatory requirement. Maybe we'll just quickly see if Elaine wants to add anything. Wangari, Elaine, do you want to add any comments or advice to our listeners in terms of this registration journey? As it is a journey, it's just registration on its own is just the beginning of your compliance journey, right?
Yes, definitely. Compliance does sound like a big word, big scary word, and registration being the first step. can seem like a very, for example, expensive process in terms of carrying out data mapping, as Rosemary highlighted. But I would like to sort of encourage our listeners to utilize available resources online or other platforms that have been created in Kenya or abroad on starting the process. So, for example, taking charge and listening to this podcast, that is a great way to start to understand what are the key things that you need and starting to put those in place. Additionally, if you do have the resources, I would say definitely take on board, either from a consultancy perspective or employment perspective, a data protection specialist, because these are people who are very well trained and specialize in this area, and they will help take you through that journey. However, if you cannot afford this, I believe the ODPC does issue guidances, which are publicly available when you go on their website. For example, on registration alone, the ODPC has issued FAQs highlighting every single thing that we've talked about today. So that is definitely a great place to start, to have that in writing and to see then what you need to do, where you need to go, what resources you actually need to put in place. So as much as it is a big, scary word, compliance, it is definitely achievable. It is not an end goal because it's an everyday process. As long as you're running a business, you will need to comply. As long as you're changing your business model, you have to keep in mind what's changing and how can you improve that.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And as Elaine has said, there is a lot of information on ODPC's website. They have a call center team ready to support you through this process. So you can email them if you're stuck through the process. So there's a lot of support to get through this. And of course, entities like Kenya Privacy Professionals Association and others are there to support people who are new to this whole data protection area. So I think it's just deciding that you want to take this journey and then finding the support structure you need to take this journey and start somewhere, right? So Rosemary, do you have any final comments?
I think final comments are this. As SMEs, you must not only be curious about data protection, you must actually be compliant. So just encouraging that it may look daunting, but it's actually very simple and even helps you build your reputation as a business. So go ahead, register, and reach out to professionals to assist. And I think Meshach should be able to share about the partners that are involved. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. So we come to the end of our show. Thank you for listening. I realize I forgot to mention my name at the beginning. I'm Meshach Masibu with the D4D Hub. So to stay updated on data protection laws and concerns, be sure to follow AU D4D Hub throughout the coming weeks. It's a six-part series. So thank you very much, our guest moderator Priya and the two speakers, Rosemary and Elaine Wangari. So bits about the podcast. The Data Protectors podcast is produced in collaboration between GIZ Kenya and Kicternet as part of the AU D4D Hub project. You can follow them on the different social media platforms. On Twitter, it's at D4D Hub _AU. You can also contact us there for questions and comments. And if you're listening to this podcast on Anchor, you can leave a voice message or a comment. Yeah, don't forget that all the episodes in this series are available on the D4D Access website. D4D Access is an online platform that's powered by the AU D4D Hub, which aims to promote exchanges of knowledge and expertise between Africa and Europe in terms of the digital field and among digital stakeholders. Feel free to visit their website at www.d4daccess.eu. Thank you so much and see you next time.